The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty street as Elizabeth packed the last of her belongings into the worn leather trunk. Her hand shook slightly as she folded her mother's best dress, the blue one with tiny white flowers that she had worn to church every Sunday back in Boston. Now it would travel west in a covered wagon, heading toward a future she could never have imagined just 3 months ago. Everything had changed when her father died suddenly of a heart attack. The debts he had hidden came rushing forward like water through a broken dam. The house, the furniture, even her teaching position at the local school, all of it slipped away faster than she could count. Her only choice was to join her uncle's family heading to Oregon Territory, where land was free and a person could start fresh. The Henderson wagon train stretched out along the Missouri River like a long snake made of white canvas and wooden wheels. 23 families had gathered for this journey, each carrying their hopes and fears in weathered wagons pulled by oxen and horses. Elizabeth felt like a fish out of water among these experienced pioneers who spoke easily about river crossings in Indian territories. She climbed onto the wooden seat of her uncle's wagon and looked around nervously. Most of the women wore simple cotton dresses and sturdy boots, their faces already tanned from working outdoors. Elizabeth's pale hands and clean dress marked her as someone who had lived an easy city life. She tried to ignore the whispered conversations and pointed looks from the other travelers. "Don't mind them," her Aunt Martha said quietly, settling beside her on the wagon seat. "They'll warm up once they see what you're made of." This journey has a way of showing people's true character. At the front of the wagon train, a tall man on horseback raised his hand to signal the start. This was Daniel Coleman, the wagon master who would guide them across 2,000 miles of wilderness. Elizabeth had heard the other women talking about him during the past few days. He was a widower, they said, who had lost his wife during their first attempt to reach Oregon. Now he made his living helping other families make the journey he couldn't complete with his own. Daniel rode back along the line of wagons, checking that everything was secure and ready for travel. When he reached Elizabeth's wagon, he stopped and touched the brim of his hat politely. "Morning, ladies. First time on the trail?" "For me, yes," Elizabeth replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "My aunt and uncle made this trip before, but they moved back east to settle some family business." Daniel nodded, his gray eyes taking in her nervous expression and city clothes. "It's a hard journey, but manageable if you follow the rules and help each other. Stay close to the wagon train, conserve your water, and don't try to carry more than necessary. The trail has a way of teaching those lessons whether you want to learn them or not." His voice was kind but firm, like a teacher explaining important facts to a student. Elizabeth found herself studying his weathered face and strong hands as he spoke. There was something steady about him that made her feel slightly less afraid. "I'll do my best," she said simply. "That's all anyone can ask," Daniel replied. Then he rode forward to check on the next wagon, leaving Elizabeth with a strange feeling of warmth despite the morning chill. The wagons began to move with creaking wheels and jingling harnesses. Elizabeth gripped the wooden seat as their oxen lurched forward, following the wagon ahead. The city girl, who had never traveled further than the next town over, was now heading into the unknown wilderness. The first day brought a constant stream of new experiences. The wagon rocked and bounced over every stone and hole in the rough trail. Dust rose from the wheels ahead, coating everything with a fine layer of grit. Elizabeth's back ached from sitting on the hard wooden seat, and her hands grew sore from gripping the rails to keep from falling off. When the wagon train stopped for the midday meal, Elizabeth climbed down carefully, her legs shaky from the constant movement. Around her, the other women quickly set up cooking fires and began preparing food with practiced efficiency. Elizabeth stood awkwardly to one side, unsure how to help. "Here," said a woman with kind eyes and graying hair. "I'm Catherine Wells. You can help me gather buffalo chips for the fire." Elizabeth looked confused. "Buffalo chips?" Catherine laughed gently. "Dried buffalo dung. Burns real good when there's no wood around. Don't worry, it doesn't smell bad when it's dry. You'll get used to frontier ways soon enough." Together they walked away from the wagons, looking for the dried pieces that dotted the prairie grass. Elizabeth wrinkled her nose at first, but Catherine was right. The dried chips didn't smell bad, and they burned with a steady flame that cooked their simple meal of beans and hardtack. As the afternoon wore on, Elizabeth began to notice how everything worked together in the wagon train. The men took turns scouting ahead and watching for problems. The women shared cooking duties and helped care for each other's children. Even the older children had jobs, gathering fuel, watching the younger ones, helping with the animals. When evening came, the wagons formed a large circle for protection and shelter. Elizabeth helped her aunt prepare their evening meal, grateful for the chance to rest her aching body. The smell of wood smoke and cooking food filled the air as families gathered around their fires. Daniel Coleman moved through the camp, checking on each family and discussing the next day's travel. When he reached their fire, he accepted a cup of coffee from Martha and sat down on a nearby log. "How did your first day go?" he asked Elizabeth directly. "Better than I expected, though I have a lot to learn," she answered honestly. "Everyone has been kind enough to help me." "That's the way it has to be out here," Daniel said, looking into the dancing flames. "We all depend on each other. What one person can't do, another can help with. What one family lacks, another might have extra." Elizabeth studied his profile in the firelight. Despite his serious manner, she could see lines of kindness around his eyes. She wondered what had driven him to make this dangerous journey over and over again, leading other families toward their dreams while his own had ended in tragedy. "How many times have you made this trip?" she asked. "This will be my 5th crossing," Daniel replied. "Each one teaches me something new. The trail changes with the weather and the season. Rivers rise and fall. Sometimes you find new shortcuts, sometimes old roads wash out. It must be lonely," Elizabeth said softly, then immediately regretted speaking so personally. Daniel was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but there's satisfaction in helping people reach their new homes safely. Every family that makes it to Oregon represents hope for the future." As the evening grew darker, Elizabeth wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and listened to the sounds of the camp settling down for the night. Somewhere in the distance, a harmonica played a gentle tune. Children's voices called out final goodnights. The oxen and horses stirred restlessly in their makeshift corral. For the first time since her father's death, Elizabeth felt a small spark of hope. This journey would be hard, but maybe it would also lead to something better than what she had left behind. As she prepared for sleep in the wagon bed, she thought about Daniel's words. Every family represented hope for the future. Perhaps that included her too. 3 weeks into the journey, Elizabeth's soft city hands had developed calluses from handling rope and canvas. Her once pale face now showed the first signs of a tan from long days under the prairie sun. The daily routine of the wagon train had become as familiar as breathing. Wake before dawn, pack quickly, walk beside the oxen through the morning, stop briefly for the midday meal, then push forward until evening. The landscape had changed from the rolling green hills of Missouri to the endless grasslands that stretched toward the horizon like a vast ocean. Elizabeth had learned to love the way the wind moved through the tall grass, creating waves that reminded her of the ocean she had seen only once as a child. But she had also learned to respect the dangers hidden in this beautiful emptiness. Water was becoming precious. Daniel had explained that they would soon leave the last reliable streams behind and enter country where every drop had to be carefully saved. Elizabeth watched the other women ration their washing water, using the same basin to clean dishes, then clothes, then finally to water the animals. Nothing was wasted. "You're learning fast," Catherine Wells told her one morning as they walked together beside the slow-moving oxen. "Most city folks take twice as long to figure out trailways." Elizabeth smiled, grateful for the older woman's friendship. Catherine had become her teacher in the practical skills of frontier life: how to build a fire that wouldn't blow out in the wind, how to cook beans so they didn't burn on the bottom, how to mend a torn wagon cover with strong, even stitches. "I had good teachers," Elizabeth replied, "and I'm motivated to learn. Going back isn't an option for me." As they talked, Elizabeth noticed Daniel riding back along the line of wagons. He did this several times each day, checking for problems and keeping everyone together. Today he stopped beside their wagon and dismounted to walk with them. "Morning, ladies. How are your oxen holding up?" "Buck is favoring his right front foot a little," Elizabeth reported, pointing to the lead ox. "I noticed it yesterday evening." Daniel moved forward to examine the animal, running his hands down the ox's leg and checking each hoof carefully. Elizabeth was surprised by how gentle his touch was with the large animal. "Good eye," he said approvingly. "There's a small stone caught between his toes. We'll take care of that at the next stop." He looked at Elizabeth with what might have been respect. "Most people don't notice when their animals are having trouble until it becomes a serious problem." Elizabeth felt a warm glow at his praise. Over the past weeks, she had begun to look forward to Daniel's daily checks on their wagon. He always had practical advice or useful information about the trail ahead. More than that, she found herself drawn to his quiet competence and the way he seemed to genuinely care about every person in the wagon train. That afternoon, when they stopped to rest the animals and eat their midday meal, Daniel showed Elizabeth how to remove the stone from Buck's hoof and check for any damage. His hands guided hers as she learned to handle the large ox safely. "The key is to stay calm and move slowly," he explained, his voice close to her ear as they worked together. "Animals can sense when you're nervous or afraid. If you're confident, they trust you." Elizabeth tried to focus on his instructions, but she was very aware of his presence beside her. His hands were strong and sure, scarred from years of hard work but surprisingly gentle, when their fingers brushed as he showed her the proper grip. She felt a small electric shock that had nothing to do with the dry prairie air. After the ox was treated and comfortable, Daniel helped Elizabeth to her feet. For a moment they stood close together, and she thought she saw something in his eyes besides professional concern. Then he stepped back and touched his hat brim politely. "You did well. Buck should be fine now." As the days passed, Elizabeth found herself taking on more responsibilities around the wagon train. She helped other women with their children when they fell sick from drinking bad water. She used her teaching skills to help organize lessons for the older children who were missing school during the long journey. She even volunteered for night watch duty, staying awake to tend the fires and watch for any signs of trouble. One evening, as she sat by the dying embers of the campfire during her watch, Daniel approached quietly. He carried 2 cups of coffee and offered one to her. "Thought you might need this," he said, settling down on a nearby log. "Gets cold out here after midnight." "Thank you," Elizabeth said gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "It's peaceful, though. I never saw stars like this back in Boston." Daniel looked up at the brilliant display overhead. Out here, far from any city lights, the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of diamonds. "One of the things I love about the trail," he said quietly, "makes you feel small, but in a good way. Reminds you that there's something bigger than your daily troubles." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the prairie, the distant call of a coyote, the soft movements of the animals in their corral, the whisper of wind through the grass. "Can I ask you something?" Elizabeth said finally. "Sure. Why do you keep making this journey? Catherine told me you've guided wagon trains for 3 years now. That's a lot of time away from any kind of settled life." Daniel was quiet for so long that Elizabeth thought he might not answer. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful and a little sad. "After my wife died, I couldn't stay in one place. Everywhere I looked reminded me of what I'd lost. But out here, helping other families reach their dreams, I feel like I'm doing something worthwhile, something she would have approved of." Elizabeth felt her heart squeeze with sympathy. She had lost her father, but Daniel had lost the person he had chosen to build a life with. She could only imagine how devastating that must have been. "She must have been a special person," Elizabeth said gently. "She was," Daniel replied. "She believed in new beginnings, in the idea that people could start over and build something better. I guess I keep making this trip because it keeps me connected to that hope." They talked quietly until Elizabeth's watch ended and another person came to tend the fires. As Daniel walked her back to her wagon, Elizabeth felt that something had shifted between them. He had shared something personal with her, trusted her with his pain and his motivations. It made her feel closer to him than all their practical conversations about oxen and water barrels. The next morning brought new challenges. A wheel on the Morrison family's wagon cracked as they crossed a rocky stretch of trail. Everyone had to stop while the men worked together to repair it, using spare wood and metal fittings that each family carried for emergencies. Elizabeth watched Daniel direct the repair work with quiet authority. He seemed to know exactly what needed to be done and how to organize the men to do it efficiently. But he also listened to suggestions from others and gave credit where it was due. She could see why people trusted him to guide them across such dangerous country. While the men worked on the wheel, the women prepared an early midday meal, and the children played games in the shade of the wagons. Elizabeth found herself helping young Tommy Morrison with his letters, using a stick to draw in the dirt since they had no slates or paper to spare. "Miss Elizabeth," Tommy said as he carefully copied the letter B. "Will there be schools in Oregon?" "I hope so," Elizabeth replied. That's one of the reasons I'm going there, to help start schools for children like you. Daniel says Oregon has towns with real buildings and everything, Tommy continued, his tongue sticking out slightly as he concentrated on his writing, and trees so big you can't see the tops. Elizabeth smiled at the boy's excitement. Despite the hardships of the trail, all the children seemed to view this journey as a great adventure. She envied their ability to focus on the possibilities ahead rather than the difficulties of each day. As the afternoon wore on and the repaired wagon resumed its place in the line, Elizabeth walked beside her oxen and thought about her conversation with Daniel the night before. She was beginning to understand that this journey was changing her in ways she hadn't expected. She was becoming stronger, more confident, more capable of handling whatever challenges came her way. But she was also becoming more aware of her feelings for the quiet man who led their wagon train. Each day brought new opportunities to see his character, his fairness in settling disputes, his patience with difficult people, his genuine concern for everyone's welfare. She found herself looking forward to their brief conversations and thinking about him during the long, dusty hours of travel. As evening approached and the wagons formed their protective circle for another night, Elizabeth helped her aunt prepare their simple meal and thought about tomorrow. Each day brought them closer to Oregon, but it also brought her closer to Daniel Coleman. She wondered if he was beginning to feel the same connection she felt, or if she was simply a responsibility to him like all the other people under his care. Time would tell, she thought as she settled down for another night under the endless prairie stars. The sky had been growing darker all afternoon, with heavy clouds building on the western horizon like gray mountains. Daniel had been watching them nervously, pushing the wagon train harder than usual to reach higher ground before the storm hit. But the prairie had other plans. Elizabeth noticed the change in the air first, a strange stillness that made the hair on her arms stand up, followed by a cool breeze that felt almost cold after weeks of hot, dry wind. The oxen became restless, their ears twitching and their eyes rolling nervously. Even the children seemed to sense that something was coming, staying closer to their parents instead of running alongside the wagons as they usually did. "Storm's going to be a big one," her Uncle Robert said, looking up at the approaching clouds. "We need to find shelter fast." But they were in the middle of open prairie with no trees or hills to break the wind. Daniel rode back along the line, shouting instructions to each family. "Circle the wagons tight. Tie down everything loose. Get the animals secured before the wind hits." The families worked quickly, but the storm moved faster than anyone expected. The first drops of rain began falling just as Elizabeth finished helping to tie down their wagon cover. Within minutes, those scattered drops became a downpour that soaked everyone to the skin. Then the wind arrived. It hit the wagon train like a giant invisible hand, rocking the heavy wagons and sending loose items flying through the air. Elizabeth grabbed onto the wagon wheel as a gust nearly knocked her off her feet. The rain was falling so hard now that she could barely see the next wagon in the circle. "Get inside," Daniel shouted over the howling wind as he rode past their wagon. "This is going to get worse." Elizabeth and her aunt climbed into the back of their wagon, just as the real fury of the storm unleashed itself. Lightning split the sky with brilliant white flashes, followed immediately by thunder so loud it seemed to shake the very ground. The wagon rocked back and forth like a boat in rough seas. "I've never seen anything like this," Martha whispered, clutching Elizabeth's hand as another lightning bolt illuminated their small canvas shelter. Through the gaps in the wagon cover, Elizabeth could see other families huddled in their wagons waiting for the storm to pass. But this was no ordinary prairie thunderstorm. The wind was getting stronger and she could hear things breaking and crashing outside. Suddenly a massive gust of wind caught their wagon cover like a sail. Elizabeth felt the whole wagon tip sideways, balancing for a terrifying moment on two wheels before crashing back down. Her aunt screamed as their water barrel broke loose and rolled into Elizabeth, knocking her against the side of the wagon. "We have to get out," Robert shouted from the front of the wagon. "She's going to tip over." But before anyone could move, another gust hit them even harder. This time the wagon didn't come back down. Elizabeth felt the sickening sensation of falling as their entire wagon rolled over onto its side, throwing all three of them into a tangle of blankets, supplies, and broken wood. Elizabeth's head struck something hard and stars exploded behind her eyes. When her vision cleared, she found herself trapped under the overturned wagon with rain pouring in through tears in the canvas. She could hear her uncle calling her name, but his voice seemed to be coming from far away. "I'm here. She called back, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. She tried to move and felt a sharp pain in her shoulder. Something heavy was pinning her legs and water was beginning to pool around her. Outside, she could hear Daniel's voice shouting orders over the storm. "Check every wagon. Make sure everyone's accounted for." Elizabeth tried to call out to him, but the wind was too loud. She was trapped in a small pocket of space under the overturned wagon, and the water level was slowly rising. Panic began to set in as she realized that her uncle and aunt must have been thrown clear when the wagon rolled. But she was stuck underneath. Time seemed to stretch forever as she lay there listening to the storm rage above her. The water was up to her waist now, and she was getting colder by the minute. She tried again to move the heavy object pinning her legs, but it wouldn't budge. Then she heard footsteps splashing through the water outside, and Daniel's voice calling her name. "Elizabeth! Elizabeth, where are you? Here!" she called with all her strength. "I'm under the wagon." The footsteps moved closer, and she could hear Daniel talking to someone else, probably her uncle. "She's trapped underneath. We need to lift this side enough for her to crawl out." Elizabeth felt the wagon shift slightly above her, and a small opening appeared near her head. Daniel's face appeared in the gap, his hair plastered to his head with rain and his eyes wild with concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked, having to shout over the wind. "My shoulder and my legs are pinned," she called back. "But I can move them. We're going to lift the wagon. When I tell you, crawl toward my voice as fast as you can. Ready?" Elizabeth nodded, gathering her strength. She could hear Daniel organizing the other men outside. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. The wagon lifted just enough to free her legs. Elizabeth ignored the pain in her shoulder and crawled toward Daniel's voice, feeling his strong hands grab her arms and pull her out into the storm. But they weren't safe yet. The wind was still howling, and debris was flying through the air like weapons. Daniel half-carried, half-dragged Elizabeth toward the partial shelter of another wagon that was still upright. "Stay down," he shouted, pushing her to the ground behind a wagon wheel as a piece of canvas flew past their heads. They huddled there together as the storm continued to rage around them. Daniel had his arm around Elizabeth, holding her close to share his body heat as the cold rain soaked through their clothes. Elizabeth was shivering uncontrollably, as much from shock as from the cold. "You're safe now," Daniel said close to her ear, his voice somehow calm despite the chaos around them. The storm's starting to weaken. Elizabeth looked up at his face so close to hers in the dim light under the wagon. His eyes were full of concern, and she realized that he had risked his own safety to find her and pull her out. The thought made her feel warm despite the cold rain. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought I was going to drown under there." "I wouldn't let that happen," Daniel replied, and something in his voice made Elizabeth's heart skip a beat. It wasn't just the words of a wagon master taking care of his responsibilities. There was something personal in his tone, something that spoke of deeper feelings. As they waited for the storm to pass, Elizabeth became acutely aware of Daniel's arm around her, of the way he kept checking to make sure she was all right, of how he positioned his own body to shield her from the worst of the wind and rain. She had always thought of him as strong and capable, but now she was experiencing his protectiveness firsthand. Gradually, the wind began to die down, and the lightning moved farther away. The rain continued, but it was no longer the driving torrent that had nearly drowned her. Daniel helped Elizabeth to her feet, keeping his arm around her waist when he noticed she was unsteady. The wagon train was a disaster. 3 wagons had overturned completely, and 2 others had lost their covers. Supplies were scattered across the muddy ground, and several of the animals had broken free during the chaos, but miraculously everyone was alive. "We'll camp here tonight," Daniel announced to the bedraggled group. "No point in trying to travel until we can assess the damage and recover what we can." Elizabeth's uncle and aunt rushed over to make sure she was all right. Her aunt fussed over her wet clothes and injured shoulder while her uncle surveyed the wreckage of their wagon. "Lost about half our supplies," Robert reported grimly, "but we can make do with what's left. The important thing is that Elizabeth is safe." As the evening wore on, the families worked together to salvage what they could and set up temporary shelters for the night. Elizabeth found herself helping to tend the injured, mostly cuts and bruises, though old Mrs. Patterson had a badly sprained wrist from being thrown around in her wagon. Daniel appeared at her side as she was bandaging a cut on young Tommy Morrison's forehead. "How are you feeling?" he asked quietly. "Sore but grateful to be alive," Elizabeth replied honestly. "How bad is the damage to the train?" "We'll be here at least 2 days making repairs," Daniel said. "Maybe 3. Some of the wagons need major work before they can travel again. As they talked, Elizabeth became aware that the other people around them were watching their interaction with interest. She realized that Daniel's dramatic rescue of her from the overturned wagon had been witnessed by several families, and people were beginning to talk. But for the first time since joining the wagon train, Elizabeth didn't care what people thought. The storm had shown her something important about Daniel Coleman, and about her own feelings for him. When she thought she might die under that wagon, his face was what she had hoped to see again. When he held her safe in his arms, she had felt more protected and cared for than ever before in her life. Later that night, as Elizabeth lay on a blanket under the stars instead of in her usual place inside the wagon, she thought about the storm and what it had changed. The weather had passed, but something had shifted between her and Daniel that couldn't be undone. She had seen the fear in his eyes when he thought she might be seriously hurt. She had felt the way he held her as if she was precious to him. The 3 days spent repairing storm damage became some of the most meaningful of Elizabeth's life. With the wagon train stopped beside a small creek, the usual urgent pace of travel gave way to a different rhythm. Families worked together to rebuild what the storm had destroyed, and in the process, Elizabeth found herself spending more time with Daniel than ever before. Her own wagon had been damaged beyond quick repair. The wooden frame was cracked in 2 places, and most of their canvas cover was torn beyond use. While her Uncle Robert worked with the other men to fix the structural damage, Elizabeth helped Daniel inventory the supplies that had been scattered across the prairie. "This flour is ruined," she said, opening a sack that had split open during the storm. "But the salt and sugar are still good if we can dry them out." Daniel made notes in his small leather journal, keeping track of what each family had lost and what they still had. It was important information for planning the rest of the journey. They would need to know where to reduce weight and where to share resources. "You're good at this," he said, watching her carefully sort through damaged goods to find what could still be used. Most people would just throw everything away and declare it all lost. Elizabeth smiled, pleased by his praise. "My father always said waste not, want not. Besides, we can't afford to be wasteful out here." As they worked side by side, their conversations gradually moved beyond practical matters. Daniel told her about his childhood on a farm in Ohio, how he had learned to read by candlelight after long days of work, and how he had always dreamed of seeing the mountains and valleys of the far west. "What made you want to be a teacher?" he asked as they sat by the creek during the midday break, sharing a simple meal of hardtack and dried fruit. "I love watching children learn," Elizabeth replied. "There's something magical about the moment when a concept suddenly makes sense to them. Their whole face lights up and you can see their world expanding right before your eyes." Daniel studied her face as she spoke, and Elizabeth felt a warm flush under his steady gaze. She had never talked about her passion for teaching with someone who seemed so genuinely interested in her thoughts and feelings. "You must miss it," he said quietly. "Having to leave your school behind?" "I do," Elizabeth admitted. "But I'm hoping to start a new school in Oregon. There will be children there who need education, and I'll have the chance to build something from the ground up." "Tell me about your plans," Daniel said, settling back against a fallen log. "What kind of school do you want to create?" Elizabeth's eyes lit up as she described her dreams. A school that would serve children of all backgrounds, where practical skills would be taught alongside reading and arithmetic, where older students would help teach younger ones. As she talked, she noticed that Daniel was listening with complete attention, asking thoughtful questions and offering his own ideas. "You could teach adults too," he suggested. "There are plenty of grown folks who never had the chance to learn reading and writing properly. They'd benefit from evening classes." "That's a wonderful idea," Elizabeth said, excited by the possibility. "And you could help with the practical subjects, surveying, basic engineering, animal husbandry. You know so much about all of those things." The words were out of her mouth before she realized what she was suggesting, that they might work together in Oregon, building something as partners. Daniel's expression became thoughtful, and for a moment Elizabeth worried that she had overstepped some invisible boundary. "I'd like that," he said finally, his voice soft. "I'd like that very much." Their eyes met across the small space between them, and Elizabeth felt her heart speed up. There was something in Daniel's expression that went beyond friendship or partnership, something that made her feel warm and slightly breathless. The moment was interrupted by young Tommy Morrison running up to them with tears streaming down his face. "Miss Elizabeth," Daniel, come quick. Mom was real sick. They both jumped up immediately, their personal conversation forgotten in the face of emergency. Mrs. Morrison was lying in her wagon, pale and feverish, with her husband hovering anxiously beside her. Started this morning, Mr. Morrison explained. First, she couldn't keep any food down, now she's burning up with fever. Elizabeth felt the woman's forehead and checked her pulse while Daniel asked about her symptoms. It was clear that Mrs. Morrison had contracted some kind of illness, possibly from drinking contaminated water during the storm. "We need to get her fever down," Elizabeth said, taking charge of the medical situation, "and keep her hydrated with small sips of clean water." For the next 2 days, Elizabeth barely left Mrs. Morrison's side. She used skills she had learned from her mother, who had often served as an unofficial nurse in their Boston neighborhood. Daniel helped by organizing the other families to provide support, bringing fresh water, preparing special foods for the invalid, and taking care of the Morrison children. Working together to care for the sick woman created a new kind of intimacy between Elizabeth and Daniel. They shared the night watches, taking turns to monitor Mrs. Morrison's condition and comfort her when the fever made her restless. During the quiet hours before dawn, they talked in low voices about everything and nothing. Daniel told her about the places he had seen on previous crossings, the towering rock formations of Chimney Rock, the challenging river crossings, the vast forests of the Oregon Territory. Elizabeth shared stories about her students back in Boston, describing their personalities and struggles, with such fondness that Daniel could see how much she had loved her. "Work, you're going to be a wonderful teacher in Oregon," he said during one of these quiet conversations. "Those children will be lucky to have you." "If I make it that far," Elizabeth replied, suddenly feeling the weight of all the dangers still ahead of them. Daniel reached over and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring in the cool pre-dawn air. "You'll make it," he said with quiet conviction. "You're stronger than you know, Elizabeth. This journey has shown me that about you." The way he said her name with such warmth and certainty made Elizabeth's breath catch. She looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how right it felt to have his fingers intertwined with hers. "So are you," she said softly. "Stronger than you know, I mean. The way you take care of everyone, the way you never seem to doubt yourself even when everything goes wrong. It's remarkable." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his thumb gently stroking across her knuckles. "I doubt myself all the time," he said finally, "especially about personal things. I made promises to my wife that I thought I'd keep forever. Being drawn to someone else feels like betraying her memory." Elizabeth's heart squeezed with sympathy for his struggle. She could see the pain in his face, the conflict between his growing feelings and his sense of loyalty to the past. "I don't think love is a betrayal," she said carefully. "I think it's a gift. If your wife loved you, wouldn't she want you to be happy again?" "Maybe," Daniel replied, but his voice was uncertain. It's hard to know what she would have wanted. When Mrs. Morrison's fever finally broke on the 3rd day, the whole wagon train celebrated. The woman was weak but clearly recovering, and the crisis had brought everyone closer together. Elizabeth felt a deep satisfaction in having helped save a life, but she also felt the loss of those intimate late-night conversations with Daniel. As the wagon train prepared to resume travel, Daniel sought her out while she was helping to pack their repaired wagon. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for everything you did for the Morrison family. You probably saved her life." "We saved her life," Elizabeth corrected. "I couldn't have done it without your help organizing everything else." Daniel smiled, and Elizabeth realized it was the first completely unguarded smile she had ever seen from him. It transformed his whole face, making him look younger and happier. "We make a good team," he said. "Yes," Elizabeth agreed, meeting his eyes directly. "We do." As the wagons rolled west again, Elizabeth felt that something fundamental had changed between them. The careful distance Daniel had maintained was gone, replaced by an easy companionship that felt natural and right. He rode beside her wagon more often now, sharing observations about the landscape and asking her opinion on decisions about the route. The other families had begun to notice their growing closeness. Elizabeth caught knowing looks between the women when Daniel lingered at their campfire in the evenings. She heard whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, but instead of feeling embarrassed or worried about gossip, she found that she didn't care what people thought. For the first time since her father's death, Elizabeth felt genuinely happy. The future was still uncertain, and the journey ahead was still dangerous, but she was no longer facing it alone. Whatever was growing between her and Daniel felt like the most natural thing in the world, as inevitable as the turning of the seasons or the rising of the sun. Each day brought them closer to Oregon, but it also brought Elizabeth closer to a decision she would soon have to make. Her feelings for Daniel were becoming impossible to ignore, and she was beginning to suspect that he felt the same way about her. The question was whether either of them would have the courage to speak openly about what was happening between them. Fort Laramie rose from the prairie like a small piece of civilization dropped into the wilderness. After 6 weeks of nothing but grass and sky, the sight of actual buildings with real walls and roofs made everyone in the wagon train almost giddy with excitement. Elizabeth stood on the wagon seat to get a better look as they approached the trading post that marked the halfway point of their journey. "Look at that," she breathed, watching smoke rise from real chimneys, actual windows with glass in them. Daniel rode up beside their wagon, his face showing the same mixture of relief and pleasure that everyone felt at reaching this milestone. "We'll rest here for 3 days," he announced. "Time to repair equipment, trade for supplies, and let everyone recover their strength before we tackle the mountains." The trading post was a bustling place, full of other wagon trains heading west and traders bringing goods from the eastern settlements. Elizabeth marveled at the variety of people: mountain men in buckskin, soldiers from the nearby military post, Native Americans trading buffalo robes and beadwork, and dozens of immigrants like themselves, all heading toward new lives in the far territories. But what struck her most was the way Daniel seemed to relax once they were safely within the fort's walls. The constant tension of watching for problems on the trail lifted from his shoulders, and Elizabeth saw glimpses of the man he might be when he wasn't carrying the responsibility for 23 families on his back. "Want to see the store?" he asked her after they had set up camp in the area designated for wagon trains. "They might have some supplies we need." Elizabeth nodded eagerly, grateful for the chance to walk beside him without worrying about oxen or wagon wheels, or the dozen other concerns that usually occupied their attention on the trail. The trading post store was a wonder of civilization, after weeks of prairie emptiness. Real wooden shelves held bolts of cloth, tools, medicines, books, and foods that the wagon train hadn't seen since leaving Missouri. Elizabeth ran her fingers over a piece of blue calico, marveling at how soft it felt after weeks of handling nothing but rough canvas and leather. "You should get some," Daniel said quietly. "When we reach Oregon, you'll want something pretty to wear." Elizabeth looked up at him, surprised by the personal nature of his comment. His eyes were warm as he watched her touch the fabric, and she felt that familiar flutter of her heart that happened whenever he looked at her that way. "It's beautiful," she said, "but I should save my money for more practical things." "Sometimes pretty things are practical too," Daniel replied. "They remind us that there's beauty in the world, even when times are hard." As they continued through the store, Daniel helped her select items that would be useful for the remaining journey. A better knife for preparing food, a warm shawl for the cold mountain nights ahead, and a small bottle of medicine in case anyone else fell sick. But he also insisted on buying her a small leather-bound journal. "For your thoughts about the journey," he explained when she protested the expense, "and for planning your school when we reach Oregon." Elizabeth accepted the gift with genuine pleasure, touched by his thoughtfulness. As they walked back toward their camp, she found herself thinking about the way he had said, "when we reach Oregon," as if he took for granted that they would complete the journey together. That evening, the families from their wagon train mingled with other travelers around the fort, sharing news and comparing experiences. Elizabeth listened to stories from people who had already made the crossing to Oregon, trying to prepare herself mentally for the challenges that still lay ahead. "The mountains are the hardest part," warned a man who was heading back east after spending 2 years in the Oregon Territory. "Snow in the passes even in summer, and roads so steep the oxen can barely pull the wagons. Lost 3 families from our train to accidents in the Rockies." Elizabeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. She glanced around for Daniel and found him listening to the same stories with a grim expression. When their eyes met across the circle of firelight, she saw the weight of responsibility settling back onto his shoulders. Later, after the evening gathering broke up and people returned to their own camps, Elizabeth found herself restless and unable to sleep. The stars above Fort Laramie seemed different somehow, clearer and more brilliant than they had appeared on the open prairie. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and walked quietly away from the sleeping wagons, needing some time alone to think. She found a spot near the fort's wall where a pile of logs provided a comfortable seat. From here she could see the entire sweep of the star-filled sky, while still being close enough to camp to feel safe. The night air was cool and fresh, carrying the sense of wood smoke and the distant mountains. Couldn't sleep either? Elizabeth turned to find Daniel approaching, his own restlessness apparently matching hers. He settled beside her on the logs, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body in the cool air. "Too much to think about," she said simply. "The stories about the mountains? Partly that, but other things too." Elizabeth looked up at the brilliant display overhead. Being here at the fort makes everything feel more real somehow. We're really doing this, leaving everything familiar behind and heading into the unknown. Daniel followed her gaze to the stars. "Having second thoughts?" "No," Elizabeth said immediately. "Not about the journey, but I've been thinking about what comes after. What happens when we reach Oregon and everyone scatters to claim their land and build their new lives?" She could feel Daniel's attention focus on her, even though he didn't speak. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of things that neither of them had yet dared to say out loud. "I keep thinking about the school I want to build," Elizabeth continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But more than that, I think about the life I want to build. The kind of life where I'm not just surviving from day to day, but actually living, creating something meaningful with someone I care about." Her heart was pounding as she spoke these words, knowing that she was stepping into dangerous territory. But the intimacy of the starlit night and the approaching end of their time together made her brave in a way she had never been before. "Elizabeth," Daniel said softly, and something in his tone made her turn to look at him. His face was partly in shadow, but she could see the conflict in his expression. Longing warring with uncertainty, hope fighting against fear. "I care about you too," he said finally. "More than I should, probably. More than I thought I could again." Elizabeth felt her breath catch. For weeks she had wondered if her growing feelings were one-sided, if his kindness toward her was simply part of his nature as a leader and protector. To hear him admit his own feelings made her feel dizzy with relief and joy. "Why more than you should?" she asked gently. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands. "Because I made promises to someone else once. Because I failed to protect the person I loved most. Because getting close to you feels like I'm betraying her memory and setting myself up to fail you too." Elizabeth turned to face him fully, her heart aching for the pain she could hear in his voice. "Tell me about her," she said softly. Daniel looked up at her, surprised by the request. "You want to know about my wife?" "I want to know about the woman who was lucky enough to be loved by you," Elizabeth said honestly. "And I want to understand what's holding you back from believing you deserve to be happy again." For several minutes, Daniel talked about Anna, how they had met at a church social in Ohio, how she had shared his dreams of building a life in the Oregon Territory, how she had died giving birth to their son during their first attempt to make the crossing. Elizabeth listened without interruption, watching the play of emotions across his face as he remembered the wife he had lost. "She was brave," he said finally. "Braver than I was in some ways. She never doubted that we could build a good life in Oregon, even when everything went wrong." "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Elizabeth said sincerely, "and I think she would want you to be happy. I think she would want you to love again, to build the life you dreamed of together, even if it's with someone else." Daniel looked at her searchingly, as if trying to read the truth in her face. "How can you be sure?" Elizabeth took a deep breath, gathering her courage for what she was about to say. "Because if I loved someone the way she loved you, I would want them to keep living, keep loving, keep building beautiful things in the world. I wouldn't want my death to be the end of their capacity for happiness." The words hung in the air between them, more honest and vulnerable than anything Elizabeth had ever said to another person. She felt exposed and frightened, but also strangely free. She had spoken her truth, and now she had to trust Daniel to do with it what he would. "Elizabeth," Daniel said, and this time her name sounded different in his voice, tender and wondering, as if he was hearing it for the first time. "I know this is complicated," she said quickly before she could lose her nerve. "I know you're afraid of getting hurt again, and I know you feel guilty about moving on. But Daniel, I've never felt as alive as I have on this journey with you. I've never felt as safe or as valued or as hopeful about the future. She paused, looking up at the brilliant stars overhead. The morning after Elizabeth's confession brought an awkwardness that neither she nor Daniel had expected. In the harsh light of day, surrounded by the bustle of the fort and the practical concerns of preparing for the mountain crossing, their intimate conversation under the stars seemed almost like a dream. Daniel was polite but distant as he helped organize the departure from Fort Laramie. He checked on Elizabeth's wagon and family as he did with all the others, but the special warmth in his eyes was gone, replaced by the careful neutrality of a wagon master performing his duties. Elizabeth tried not to let her disappointment show, but she couldn't help wondering if she had made a terrible mistake by speaking so openly about her feelings. The change in their relationship didn't go unnoticed by the other travelers. Mrs. Henderson, the self-appointed moral authority of the wagon train, approached Elizabeth as she was helping to load supplies for the next leg of their journey. "My dear," Mrs. Henderson said in the tone of someone delivering unwelcome but necessary advice, "I feel I must speak to you about your friendship with Mr. Coleman." Elizabeth tensed, recognizing the disapproval in the older woman's voice. "What about it, Mrs. Henderson?" "People are talking," Mrs. Henderson said, glancing around to make sure they wouldn't be overheard. "About how much time you spend with him, how he looks at you. It's not appropriate for an unmarried woman to be so familiar with a man, especially when you're both alone on the trail without proper supervision." Heat rose in Elizabeth's cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "Mr. Coleman has been nothing but respectful toward me. If people choose to gossip about kindness and friendship, that says more about them than about us." Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly, but her concern remained. "I'm not questioning his character, dear. Daniel Coleman is a good man. But frontier life is hard enough without adding the complications of romance. Women die out here, Elizabeth. They die in childbirth, from accidents, from diseases we don't have doctors to treat. Is it fair to burden a man with those worries when his job is to keep all of us safe?" The words hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. She had been so focused on her own feelings and hopes that she hadn't fully considered the additional pressure her attachment to Daniel might place on him. What if his concern for her did cloud his judgment? What if worrying about her safety distracted him from his responsibilities to the other families? I hadn't thought about it that way," Elizabeth admitted quietly. "Of course you hadn't," Mrs. Henderson said kindly. "You're young and you found someone who makes you feel safe in a dangerous world. That's natural, but sometimes what feels right in the moment isn't what's best in the long run." As the wagon train pulled away from Fort Laramie and began the approach to the Rocky Mountains, Elizabeth found herself watching Daniel with new eyes. She saw how he constantly scanned the horizon for potential dangers, how he rode back and forth along the line of wagons checking for problems, how he carried the weight of 23 families' survival on his shoulders every single day. The terrain was becoming more challenging as they climbed toward the mountain passes. The trail was rockier, steeper, and more treacherous than anything they had encountered on the plains. Wagons broke down more frequently, requiring repairs that delayed the entire train. Water became scarcer, and the thin mountain air left everyone feeling tired and breathless. Elizabeth noticed that Daniel seemed more tense than usual, his attention divided between the immediate challenges of the trail and what appeared to be some internal struggle. When he looked at her, she saw confusion and longing, but also something that looked like fear. The crisis came 3 days into the mountains, when they reached a section of trail that had been washed out by spring floods. The path around the damaged area was narrow and dangerous, with a steep drop-off on one side and loose rock walls on the other. Daniel spent hours scouting the route, trying to find the safest way to get the wagons through. "We'll have to go one at a time," he announced to the gathered families. "Unload everything that isn't absolutely essential and carry it on foot. The lighter the wagons, the less chance of the wheels breaking through weak spots in the trail." The process was slow and nerve-wracking. Each wagon had to be carefully guided through the narrow passage, while people walked ahead to test the footing and behind to help if anything went wrong. Elizabeth held her breath as wagon after wagon made the treacherous crossing, praying that everyone would make it safely. When it was her family's turn, Daniel himself took the lead rope of their oxen, guiding them step by step along the dangerous path. Elizabeth walked behind the wagon, ready to help steady it if it started to tip. Halfway across, one of the wagon wheels hit a soft spot and began to sink. "Stop," Daniel called out, raising his hand to halt the oxen. "Everyone stay calm." But as he moved to check the wheel, his foot slipped on a loose stone. Elizabeth watched in horror as he fell backward toward the cliff edge, his arms windmilling as he tried to regain his balance. Without thinking, Elizabeth lunged forward and grabbed his outstretched hand, using all her strength to pull him back from the drop. For a terrifying moment they both teetered on the edge of the precipice, but then other men arrived to help pull them to safety. "Are you hurt?" Elizabeth asked breathlessly, checking Daniel for injuries as they sat together on solid ground. "I'm fine," Daniel replied, but his hands were shaking as he spoke. "You saved my life." That evening, as the wagon train made camp in a safer area beyond the washed-out trail, Daniel sought out Elizabeth for the first serious conversation they had shared since Fort Laramie. "We need to talk," he said quietly, leading her away from the campfires to a spot where they could speak privately. Elizabeth's heart sank, sensing from his tone that this conversation would not be the romantic continuation of their starlit talk at the fort. "What happened today can't happen again," Daniel said without preamble. "You put yourself in danger to save me, and that's exactly what I was afraid of." "Anyone would have done the same thing," Elizabeth protested. "You would have fallen to your death. And you could have fallen with me." Daniel's voice was sharper than she had ever heard it. "Don't you understand? I can't do my job properly if I'm constantly worried about your safety. I can't make clear decisions about the route or the risks if part of my mind is always thinking about protecting you specifically, instead of protecting everyone." Elizabeth felt tears stinging her eyes, but she forced herself to listen to his concerns. "Today I hesitated," Daniel continued, his voice quieter but still intense. "When I saw that weak spot in the trail, my first thought wasn't about the safest way to get the wagon across. My first thought was about making sure nothing happened to you. That hesitation could have gotten us all killed." "So what are you saying?" Elizabeth asked, though she was afraid she already knew. "I'm saying that Mrs. Henderson was right when she warned you about the dangers of romance on the trail. I'm saying that I can't afford to love you the way I want to, not while I'm responsible for all these people's lives." The words hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. She had known this conversation was coming, had seen it building in Daniel's distant behavior over the past few days, but hearing him say it out loud still felt devastating. "And after we reach Oregon?" she asked quietly. "What happens then?" Daniel looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "I don't know. I honestly don't know if I'm capable of loving someone without that love becoming a weakness that puts people in danger." Elizabeth stood quietly for a long moment, processing his words and the pain behind them. She could see that this decision was hurting him as much as it was hurting her, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. "I understand," she said finally, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't like it, but I understand." That night, Elizabeth lay awake in her wagon, staring up at the canvas cover and trying to make sense of her emotions. Part of her was angry at Daniel for pulling away just when they had finally acknowledged their feelings for each other. Part of her was hurt by the suggestion that their love could only be a distraction and a danger. But another part of her, the practical part that had learned to survive on the frontier, understood his reasoning. She had seen how the responsibility of leadership weighed on him, how every decision he made could mean the difference between life and death for the families under his care. Could she really ask him to risk that for the sake of her happiness? As the days passed and the wagon train struggled deeper into the mountains, Elizabeth found herself caught between hope and despair. She still believed that what she and Daniel felt for each other was real and valuable, something worth fighting for. But she also couldn't ignore the very real dangers that Mrs. Henderson and Daniel himself had pointed out. The question was whether love was always a weakness, or whether it could sometimes be a source of strength. Elizabeth didn't know the answer, but she was determined to find out, even if it meant risking her heart in the process. The mountains ahead looked cold and forbidding, but Elizabeth faced them with the same determination that had carried her this far. Whatever happened between her and Daniel, she would not let doubt and fear rob her of the future she had traveled so far to claim. The Snake River appeared before them like a brown ribbon cutting across the vast landscape, its waters running high and fast from the mountain snowmelt. Elizabeth stood beside her wagon and stared at the rushing current, feeling her stomach tighten with fear. This was the crossing that veteran travelers had warned them about, unpredictable, dangerous, and responsible for more wagon train disasters than any other obstacle on the Oregon Trail. Daniel had been scouting the crossing points for 2 days, riding up and down the riverbank with increasingly grim expressions. The unusual spring rains had made the water higher than normal, and the current was running faster than he had ever seen it. Several other wagon trains were camped nearby, all waiting for conditions to improve before attempting the crossing. "It's not getting any better," he announced to the gathered families on the 3rd evening. "If anything, the water's still rising. We can't wait much longer, or we'll risk getting caught in the mountains when the snow starts." Elizabeth watched Daniel's face as he spoke, seeing the weight of the decision he was facing. In the weeks since their conversation about keeping their relationship at a distance, she had tried to respect his wishes while still caring about him from afar. It was one of the hardest things she had ever done, loving someone while pretending not to, worrying about him while acting as if he was just another member of the wagon train. "What are our options?" asked Mr. Henderson, speaking for the group. "We can try the main crossing where most trains go over," Daniel replied. "The water's deep, but the current is more predictable. Or we can try the upper ford where it's shallower but rockier. Either way, there's risk." Elizabeth felt her Uncle Robert tense beside her. Like most of the men, he could swim a little but not well enough to save himself if he got caught in a strong current. The women and children would be completely helpless if anything went wrong. "What do you recommend?" asked Catherine Wells, voicing the question everyone was thinking. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the dark water. "I think we try the upper ford at first light. The water will be at its lowest then, and if anyone gets in trouble, there are more places to grab onto rocks and pull themselves out." That night, Elizabeth couldn't sleep. She lay in her wagon listening to the sound of the river rushing past their camp, imagining all the things that could go wrong during the crossing. She had heard stories about wagons being swept away, about families losing everything they owned to the hungry current, about children drowning within sight of their parents. Near midnight, she gave up trying to sleep and climbed quietly out of her wagon. The camp was still except for the crackling of the watchfires and the ever-present sound of the river. She walked toward the water's edge, needing to see their enemy face to face. Daniel was already there, standing alone on the bank and staring out at the rushing water. Elizabeth hesitated, remembering his request for distance, but her concern for him overcame her uncertainty. "Can't sleep either?" she asked softly, moving to stand beside him. "Too much to think about," Daniel replied without looking at her. Too many ways this could go wrong. Elizabeth could hear the strain in his voice, the weight of responsibility that kept him awake while everyone else slept. "You'll get us across safely," she said with more confidence than she felt. "You always do." Daniel finally turned to look at her, and in the moonlight she could see the doubt and fear in his eyes. "What if I don't?" he asked quietly. "What if I make the wrong choice and people die because of it? What if I'm not strong enough or smart enough to handle something this dangerous?" Elizabeth's heart ached for him. She could see that the weeks of holding himself apart from her hadn't solved his fundamental fear, that caring about people made him vulnerable, that love was a weakness that clouded his judgment. "Do you remember what you told me after the storm?" she asked gently. "You said that animals can sense when you're nervous or afraid, and if you're confident, they trust you." "This is different," Daniel said. "This isn't about confidence. This is about life and death." "No," Elizabeth said firmly. "This is about the same thing. The people in this wagon train trust you because you care about them, not in spite of it. Your love for them, for all of us, doesn't make you weak. It makes you fight harder to keep us safe." Before Daniel could respond, they heard a commotion from the direction of the camp. Voices were calling out in alarm, and they could see people running toward the river. "The Morrison wagon," someone shouted. "It broke loose from its anchor." Elizabeth and Daniel ran toward the sound of the voices, arriving at the riverbank just in time to see the Morrison family's wagon being swept downstream by the current. Somehow the ropes holding it in place had snapped, and now their entire load of supplies was disappearing into the darkness. But worse than the lost supplies was the realization that little Tommy Morrison had been sleeping in the wagon. "My boy," Mrs. Morrison screamed, running along the bank as the wagon bounced and spun in the rushing water. "Tommy's in there!" Without hesitation, Daniel plunged into the icy water, fighting against the current as he tried to reach the runaway wagon. Elizabeth watched in terror as he was immediately swept downstream, the river carrying him away from his target. Several other men had entered the water to help, but it was clear that the current was too strong for anyone to make progress against it. The wagon was moving faster than any swimmer could follow, and soon it would reach the rapids where no one could survive. Elizabeth made a split-second decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She knew the river better than the men did. She had been studying it for 3 days, memorizing every rock and eddy while the others focused on the main crossing points. There was a place downstream where the current swept close to the bank, a spot where someone might be able to intercept the wagon if they positioned themselves correctly. She ran along the bank faster than she had ever run in her life, her skirts tangling around her legs as she fought to reach the interception point before the wagon swept past it. Behind her, she could hear people shouting her name, but she didn't stop to listen. Elizabeth reached the spot just as the wagon came spinning around the bend. Without allowing herself time to think about the danger, she waded into the water up to her waist and reached out as the wagon swept past her. Her fingers caught the canvas cover, and for a moment she thought she might be able to stop it. But the current was too strong, and instead of stopping the wagon, Elizabeth found herself being dragged along with it. The icy water closed over her head as she was pulled into the main channel of the river. The world became a nightmare of rushing water and tumbling darkness. Elizabeth fought to keep her head above the surface, but the heavy wool of her dress was dragging her down. She could hear Tommy Morrison crying somewhere nearby, but she couldn't see him through the spray and darkness. Then strong arms were around her, pulling her against a solid chest. Daniel had somehow reached them, swimming with powerful strokes as he fought to keep all 3 of them afloat. Elizabeth could feel his heart pounding as he held her tight against him. "Hold on to me," he shouted over the roar of the water. "Don't let go." Elizabeth wrapped her arms around Daniel's neck as he used his free arm to grab Tommy Morrison, who was clinging to a piece of the wagon that had broken off. The 3 of them were swept downstream together, bouncing off rocks and struggling to breathe as the river carried them toward the rapids. Just when Elizabeth thought they were all going to drown, she felt Daniel's feet touch bottom. They had reached a shallow area where the river spread out and slowed down. Daniel dragged both Elizabeth and Tommy toward the bank, all 3 of them coughing up river water and shaking from cold and shock. Other people were running toward them along the bank, including Tommy's frantic parents. Elizabeth collapsed on the muddy shore, her whole body trembling as the reality of what had just happened sank in. She had almost died. "They had all almost died. What were you thinking?" Daniel demanded, kneeling beside her with water streaming from his hair and clothes. "You could have been killed." Elizabeth looked up at him, seeing the fear and anger and desperate relief all mixed together in his face. His hands were shaking as he checked her for injuries, and she realized that her near drowning had affected him as much as it had her. "I was thinking about Tommy," she said through chattering teeth. "I was thinking that I knew where the current would take the wagon, and I was the only one in position to help. You were thinking with your heart instead of your head," Daniel said, but his voice was gentler now, just like I was afraid you would. Elizabeth met his eyes directly, seeing something there that she hadn't seen since their conversation at Fort Laramie. "Yes," she said simply. "I was thinking with my heart, just like you were when you jumped into the river without hesitation to save us." Daniel stared at her for a long moment, and Elizabeth could see him processing the truth of what she had said. He had done exactly what he had accused her of doing, acted on emotion and love rather than cold calculation. And his love hadn't made him weak or ineffective. It had made him brave enough to risk his own life to save others. As the camp worked through the night to recover what they could from the Morrison wagon and prepare for the river crossing that could no longer be delayed, the Willamette Valley spread out before them like a green paradise after 5 months of dust, danger, and hardship. Elizabeth stood on a hillside overlooking the fertile farmland and felt tears of joy streaming down her face. They had made it. Against all odds, through mountain passes and river crossings, through storms and sickness and countless small disasters, they had reached the promised land of Oregon Territory. The wagon train had dwindled during the final push through the Blue Mountains. 2 families had decided to stay in the mining camps they encountered, and 1 elderly couple had been too weak to continue the journey. But 15 families had completed the crossing together, bound now by shared experiences that would connect them for the rest of their lives. Daniel rode up beside Elizabeth as she stood looking out over the valley, his own face showing the same mixture of exhaustion and triumph that she felt. Over the past month since their experience at the Snake River, The careful distance between them had gradually dissolved. They had worked together as partners, making decisions about the route and caring for the wagon train as a team. The love they shared had become a source of strength rather than a distraction, just as Elizabeth had always believed it could be. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth said softly, gesturing toward the green fields and distant mountains. "More beautiful than I ever imagined." "It is," Daniel agreed, but he was looking at her rather than at the landscape. "And we're going to build something wonderful here." The pronoun wasn't lost on Elizabeth. Somewhere along the trail, Daniel had stopped thinking about his future as a solitary journey and started imagining it as something they would create together. The first settlement they reached was Oregon City, a bustling frontier town that served as the territorial capital. After months of seeing nothing but wilderness, the sight of actual streets and buildings felt almost overwhelming. Elizabeth marveled at the sawmill, the newspaper office, the general store stocked with goods that had traveled around Cape Horn to reach this remote corner of the continent. "We'll need to register our land claims," Daniel explained as they made camp outside the town, "and decide where we want to settle. There's good farmland along the river, but the higher ground might be better for a town." "A town?" Elizabeth asked, curious about his thinking. "If you're serious about starting a school, you'll need families with children. That means we need to think about building a community, not just claiming individual homesteads." Elizabeth felt a warm glow at the way Daniel was planning their future together, thinking not just about their own needs, but about the kind of place they wanted to help create. Over the next several days, they explored the area around Oregon City, looking for the right spot to claim their land. Elizabeth was drawn to a gentle slope overlooking the Willamette River, where there was good water, fertile soil, and a grove of massive Douglas fir trees that could provide timber for building. "What do you think?" she asked Daniel as they stood together on the site she favored. "Could you imagine building a life here?" Daniel looked around thoughtfully, taking in the practical advantages of the location: the water access, the timber, the level ground suitable for farming. But Elizabeth could see that he was also responding to something less tangible, the same sense of rightness that had drawn her to this particular spot. "I can imagine it," he said finally. "I can see a house there under those big trees. A school building down closer to the river where children could come from all the surrounding farms. Maybe a church and a store if other families decide to settle nearby." "And us?" Elizabeth asked quietly. "Can you imagine us?" Daniel turned to look at her directly, his gray eyes warm with certainty. "I can't imagine anything else," he said simply. They filed their land claims the next day, officially becoming property owners in the Oregon Territory. Elizabeth signed her name to the document with a sense of profound satisfaction. For the first time in her life, she owned something substantial, 160 acres of prime farmland that no one could take away from her. But even more meaningful than the land claim was the conversation she and Daniel had that evening as they sat by their campfire outside Oregon City. "I have something to ask you," Daniel said, his voice more nervous than she had heard it since their journey began. Elizabeth's heart began to beat faster, sensing the importance of whatever he was about to say. "We've talked about building a school together, about creating a community," Daniel continued, "but I haven't properly asked if you want to build a life together, as husband and wife." Elizabeth felt joy bubbling up inside her like a spring of clear water. After all the uncertainty and separation and fear, Daniel was finally asking the question she had been hoping to hear. "Are you proposing to me?" she asked, wanting to be absolutely certain. "I'm trying to," Daniel said with a smile that transformed his entire face. "I don't have a ring to offer you, and I can't promise you an easy life. But I can promise that I'll love you with everything I have, that I'll work beside you to build something beautiful, and that I'll never again let fear keep me from telling you how much you mean to me." Elizabeth didn't hesitate for even a moment. "Yes," she said, launching herself into his arms. "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." As Daniel spun her around in the firelight, Elizabeth thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had left Boston as a frightened woman with nothing but debts and disappointment. She was ending that journey as someone who had discovered her own strength, found the love of her life, and claimed a place to build her dreams. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony performed by the territorial judge, with their fellow travelers from the wagon train serving as witnesses. Elizabeth wore the blue calico dress that Daniel had encouraged her to buy at Fort Laramie, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers picked from their own land. The ceremony was held outdoors under the Douglas fir trees where they planned to build their house. With the Willamette River sparkling in the distance, Catherine Wells cried during the vows, and even crusty old Mr. Henderson wiped his eyes when Daniel and Elizabeth promised to love each other through whatever challenges lay ahead. These people had become family during their months on the trail, and having them witness this moment made it even more special. After the ceremony, as the sun set over their new home, Elizabeth and Daniel stood together looking out over the land they would now share. The future stretched ahead of them full of work and possibility. A house to build, crops to plant, a school to establish, and eventually children of their own to raise in this beautiful valley. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't taken that journey?" Elizabeth asked, leaning against Daniel's shoulder. "Sometimes," Daniel replied, his arm tightening around her. "But then I remember that every hardship, every dangerous river crossing, every difficult decision brought us closer to this moment." "I wouldn't change any of it." Elizabeth thought about the truth of that statement. The woman who had climbed onto a wagon in Missouri 5 months ago couldn't have built the life she was planning now. She had needed to be tested and strengthened, needed to discover what she was truly capable of, before she could become the partner that Daniel needed and the teacher that Oregon's children deserved. As the stars began to appear in the clear Oregon sky, Elizabeth made a silent promise to the future. She would build the school of her dreams, helping to educate the children of this new territory. She would create a home filled with love and laughter, and she would never forget the lessons of the trail. That courage could be found in the most unlikely places, that love was always worth the risk, and that the most beautiful destinations were those reached by the hardest journeys. The wagon that had carried her across the continent sat nearby, its canvas cover gleaming white in the moonlight. Tomorrow they would begin dismantling it, using the wood and metal for more permanent construction. But tonight Elizabeth looked at it with gratitude for the shelter it had provided and the journey it had made possible. She had whispered her heart's desire to Daniel under the stars near Fort Laramie, asking him to make her his during their time on the wagon train. He had made her his wife under the Oregon sky, but more than that, he had made her his partner in building a future neither of them could have imagined when they first met on that dusty trail in Missouri, as they walked hand in hand toward the tent that would shelter them until their house was built. Elizabeth felt the deep satisfaction of dreams becoming reality. The journey was over, but the adventure of building a life together was just beginning.